as they said, I'm Simon Hadfield. I'm Professor of Robot Vision and Autonomous Systems at the University of Surrey in the UK. And I'm going to talk to you now about navigating beyond RGB, which is a collection of works that we've done trying to bring spectral sensing to mobile robotics. So I apologize if the start of this talk is going to be a bit patronizing, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same wavelength, no pun intended, and set the scene for everything I'm going to talk about going forwards. So probably everybody knows the wavelength of light is continuous, right? You can have lots of different wavelengths of light. White light is composed of many different wavelengths mixed together. And when light hits an object, some of the frequencies are absorbed, some of them are reflected with different strengths. And it depends on what the material is made of, exactly how the different wavelengths are reflected, right? So I've got an example here where we've got two different materials, aspirin and paracetamol, and you can see the reflectance spectra has a lot of detail in it, right? So there's lots of different peaks in each of these different curves that are unique to each other, which means that you should be able to look at a tablet and understand whether it's aspirin or paracetamol just based on its appearance from the reflected light. Obviously, we can't do that, and the reason that we can't do that is because human vision is based on three photoreceptors, right? Our eyes only have three types of photoreceptors in them. You probably already know this as well. So we have blue, green, and red photoreceptors. Each of them is sensitive to a particular range of wavelengths with particular strengths. So you can kind of imagine we take these rich spectra up here, we take this blue curve, we overlay it, we just sum the whole thing together, gives us one number, right? We do the same thing for the green curve and the red curve. So we blur out all of that fine detail. We just boil the entire complex spectra down to three numbers, and you can probably tell it's no longer possible to recognize the difference between these different spectra when we have such a coarse measurement of them, right? The interesting thing for this talk is that's how human vision works, but that's also how computer vision works, right? All of our camera systems are built on the idea of taking a red, green, and a blue channel. All of our displays are built out of red, green, and blue pixels, right? And it makes sense because these technologies were originally built for humans, right? So it makes sense that they would see the world the same way we do and display the world in a way that we can understand. But that legacy is limiting, right? So in recent years, we've started to imagine we might collect visual data that's not for human use, right? And so there's no longer a reason for us to restrict ourselves to the way humans see the world, okay? So most of our modern robotic systems are still built on seeing the world that way, but we don't have to do it like that. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways we can see the world. We can start with I guess there's an entire spectrum of different ways we can see the light spectrum. So we can start with our traditional red, green, and blue setup, where we have just three measurements at different wavelengths. We can imagine adding some additional ones in there, right? So we can put some extra sensitivity bands, some extra color bands in between those. Probably we would also narrow the sensitivity curves at those points as well, so they don't overlap quite as much. And you can imagine, if you keep adding more and more bands and you keep making them narrower and narrower, if you go to the extreme, you're basically approximating the continuous underlying spectrum, right? So this kind of middle area where we have a finite number of bands is often called multispectral cameras. And if we go to this extreme case where we have many, many bands, we normally would call that a hyperspectral sensor. The challenge is the more we move this direction, the more difficult the data is to deal with, right? So obviously there's a lot more data, right? Every time you add a color channel, you increase how much data you're collecting, which means it's harder to store that data, it's harder to process that data. And if we're talking about robotic systems, we have limited amounts of memory, we have limited compute power. But But there's another more subtle difficulty, right? If we keep reducing the sensitivity curves of these channels, that means less and less light falls within those curves, which means that the signal gets weaker and weaker. So the more bands we try to include, the worse the signal-to-noise ratio is. In this talk, I'm mostly going to focus on the hyperspectral case, just because it's the one that gives us the richest information about the environment, and also it's the most difficult to deal with. But most of what I'm going to talk about could also apply to multispectral sensing. Okay, so why do we care? Why do we want robots to be able to see the world better than humans can? There's lots of pros and lots of advantages for why we might do that. Right, so for example, when your robot is trying to perceive the environment and move around in the environment, one of the biggest challenges is a lack of texture, right? If everything looks the same, if there's no texture, you can't really tell how things are moving, you can't understand what's going on in the environment. The more modes of variation that you have in your perception of the environment, the more chance that one of them is going to show some texture that you can track. Okay, so even if visually to us things look textureless, there still might be invisible textures that could be tracked by the robot. I guess related to that is the idea of localization, right? So the more modes of variation we have in our description of landmarks, the more unique those landmarks are, the more certain we can be the next time we see that landmark that it definitely is the same one that we saw previously. So we can do better relocalization. Those are kind of, I guess, traditional, easy to understand mobile robotics cues. Also, there's some more interesting ones, affordances, right? So if we look at an object and we can see its reflection spectra, we might have a better idea of what that is made of. And if we know what it's made of, we might know something about its affordances, what we can do with it, right? So for example, if I look at this teapot and I know that it's made of chocolate, then I know I should not try to brew tea in that teapot, right? Similarly, if I'm looking at these strawberries, I should be able to tell which ones are ripe, which ones are unripe, which ones I should be picking, and which ones I should leave to grow. Another very interesting one is inspection and maintenance, right? If I look at this pipework, if I know the materials involved, I can recognize where there's rust, corrosion, things that need to be fixed, or if it's just dirt and grease and it's fine, I don't need to do anything about it. Right? Okay, so what type of sensors might we use to collect this data? I've kind of told you why we care about it, but how can we see it? I guess the most natural version is a spectral camera, right? So we can imagine the spectral camera is capturing a 2D grid of pixels of the environment, just like a normal camera. It just has more color bands. That has some pros and cons, right? So because we're capturing a whole 2D grid of the image at once, we kind of get a lot of information about the world. Generally, these systems are passive, right? Which is good for robotics because we don't use a lot of power. But it's bad because it makes them sensitive to the environmental lighting. Okay, so if I see a particular material under fluorescent lighting, and then I see it later under natural lighting, the reflectance spectra will look totally different because the light spectra is overlaid onto it, the source light. So that's kind of a headache. It's hard to recognize what things are. But the good thing is that we can collect data quickly. The other way that we might do it is with a spectrometer, right? So a spectrometer will normally emit light into the environment and then look at the reflection. That makes it agnostic to the lighting of the environment because it's creating its own light source. It also means it can work in the dark. The problem is it uses power because it has to generate that light. Also, generally, it will only take point measurements, right? So it will shoot a bit of light, it will see the reflection, and it will know what the spectra is of that particular point. If you want to build a map of the entire scene, you have to scan it around. It's quite slow, right? Another point that I actually haven't made on this slide is that because the spectrometer is emitting the light, the signal-to-noise ratio is much better, which means that we can have more narrower bands, whereas the passive multispectral or hyperspectral camera generally, because it's passive, it doesn't get as much light coming back, so we can't make the bands quite as narrow. Okay, so that's enough setting up of the talk. Let's get into some technical stuff. To start off, I'm going to tell you about a bit of work that we did at IROS. I guess it's a bit old now, IROS 2023, where we were trying to use spectral sensing to help localize the robot. So the setup was that we had a spectrometer, so we were taking point measurements of the spectra. We attached it onto a spinning LiDAR, right? So we were at particular bearing vectors around the robot. We measure how far away the geometry is. We also measure the spectra of the material that we see at that bearing vector. Coupled with that, we have a map of the environment which has the spectra embedded into it. Okay, so you can see this is a 2D top-down floor plan of the building where I work. And I've kind of color-coded it based on the type of materials, but in reality, every part of this map has a spectra embedded into it that says what material is present at that point in the map. So then the task is for the robot to look around itself, see what kind of materials are around it, and then for us to try and guess where must the robot be in this map in order to see that exact arrangement of geometry and materials. So the way we solved that was a kind of traditional Monte Carlo localization approach. So we had a particle filter, we had a cloud of different pose hypotheses, and we tried to score the similarity of each hypothesis, what it should see around it according to the map versus what the robot actually saw. So in order to do that, we used a kind of a likelihood field model, right? So from each pose hypothesis, we cast out rays into the map according to the bearing vectors from our scan. We look at where the endpoint of those rays are. We find the closest piece of geometry in the map. We look up its spectra. Okay, so for every point on the scan, we look up the spectra that the map tells us. We have the measurement from the real LiDAR, and we try and see how consistent they are with each other. Sorry, from the spectrometer. As for exactly how we compute that, I'm not going to go into huge detail. There's a lot of different functions. It's actually quite challenging to compare two spectra against each other because, the simple answer might be, well, I'll go through every bin and I'll subtract them from each other. The problem is different bins in these spectra have very different characteristics, right? The ultraviolet bins and the infrared bins tend to have very little light in them, so the average contrast and the average power is very low. If you try and just uniformly compute an error, you'll kind of drown out those bins. One of the techniques that we tried that was particularly effective was this mod L2. We didn't invent that, somebody else published it. But it's interesting, it's basically, we only compute the similarity based on the peaks. So we look at the peaks in our spectra, we extract the closest peak in the other spectra, we compute the difference in the height of the peaks, we compute the offset horizontally. And that allows it to be a little bit robust to things like calibration error, Doppler effects, things like that, if there's any shifts in the spectra. Okay, so once we've computed our similarity, right, we know exactly what the robot saw, and we know what the map says it should have seen. We compute a score, we combine that with some other scores based on the geometric consistency, based on the odometry, and we get an overall weight for the particles. And then we can do some standard resampling, right? So we look at the particles that have a very low weight, we throw those away. We look at the particles that have a very high weight, we create duplicates of them, and that allows us to focus our computational effort in the areas of the pose space that are the most promising. If we had an infinite compute budget, we wouldn't need to resample the population. But okay, just to take a bit of a detour for a second, one of the things that I've learned from working in this hyperspectral robotics space, there's not a lot of people working in this space, and I think part of the problem is data, right? The cameras are really expensive, and taking images with them is slow. So it's hard to create data sets. There's not a lot of data sets out there. There's data sets for computer vision problems, where I have a pine cone on a table and I rotate it around. Right? That's not a very interesting robotics problem. There's not a lot of actual robots moving around in environments. So to try and help a bit with that, When we did this work, we created a gazebo plugin for this spinning spectral sensor. And we released that to the community to try and encourage more people to get involved in this space and to get people to try and beat us. I guess the problem is that we did this 3 years ago. We wrote it in ROS 1, and now ROS 1 is out of date, and we need to update it for ROS 2. But that was our first attempt at trying to help get more people involved in this space. Okay, so looking at the results, you can see the live robot over here. You can see down here the comparison of the spectra that the robot actually sees versus what the map says it should see. So early on, there's a bit of inconsistency. At this point, I think it's kind of locked on. You can see the spectra are very consistent. But it's interesting to note, they're very unique, these spectra, right? The spectral signatures that you see are very descriptive. And so what we found was we compared against a wide range of different techniques. We compared against traditional range-based Monte Carlo localization, compared against semantic like machine learning approaches, pure learned pose estimation, 3D orb slam. And we find that the spectral information is drastically more effective because it's such a strong cue. Actually, I think one thing that's really interesting about these results is that our technique using spectral information combined with geometric information was actually worse than our technique using only spectral information. And I think that's because, like here, the robot's going down this corridor, right? Corridors, geometric cues are really bad in corridors. Everywhere along the corridor looks exactly the same geometrically. So you get a lot of drift along the axis of the corridor. And that kind of just ends up being noise. Whereas in the spectral sense, the corridor has a lot of unique materials, right? There's plaster walls, there's wooden, white painted door frames, there's laminated wood doors. So at every point going down the corridor, it knows quite precisely exactly where it is. The problem with all of this is that taking the measurements is slow. Okay, for this it was okay because we're doing a 2D localization. We only need to take a few measurements around the robot. If we wanted to do 3D localization, we would have to scan the spectrometer all over the place. It would take forever. So that kind of motivated this next bit of work, Hydra. So we took a bit of a detour into spectral reconstruction. This actually is going to be at the NT-IRE workshop at CVPR, which I guess is in a couple of months. So spectral reconstruction, if you're not familiar with the problem, is basically where we imagine that we have an input which has a low channel depth. Okay, so we've probably got a multispectral camera here, where we're collecting a whole 2D grid of pixels at once, but we don't have that many color channels available to us. And we want to try and build a module that can convert that heavily quantized picture back up to the original full channel depth picture, okay? And the reason that we care about that is it gives us consistent information across these different sensing pathways, right? So we can start with a dense grid that has low channel depth, and we can upgrade the channel depth, or we can start with a single point that has high channel depth, we can scan it around. In both cases, we can kind of build a spatially and spectrally dense input. And that means that we can build our downstream robotics algorithms to be agnostic to what type of sensor we're using, right? No matter which way we're going, we can still get the same high quality input for our algorithms. So how do we solve the spectral reconstruction problem? It's quite a difficult problem to solve. So the traditional way to do it, would just be to brute force it with machine learning, right? I've got a database of low channel depth images. I've got a database of high channel depth images. I'll train a model where the input is low channel depth, the output is high channel depth. I'll compare it with a loss function against the ground truth, and I'll just train it for a long time, right? The problem is, the problem is very under-constrained, right? The output has many more dimensions than the input, right? And to try and illustrate that problem, I've got this example here. Imagine that you're trying to pick which of these three spectra is the correct one to apply to this part of the image. If you only have these small number of viewpoints here, the spectra all overlap at those viewpoints. So it's actually not possible to uniquely define which spectra you should use, right? The way we tried to alleviate that problem is to work in a latent space. Okay, so we try, instead of going from the low dimensional input directly to the high dimensional output, we learned a latent space which had a much similar dimensionality to the input, and then we learn only to map from the input to that latent space. Okay, the way we do that is through a three-stage process. So first we have a teacher model, which is basically just a variational autoencoder, right? So we take the high-dimensional data, we compress it into a latent space, we decompress it back out, we compare it against the original, and make sure that it still looks the same. Okay, so we're learning a latent space purely on the high-dimensional data. And I guess it's worth saying, hyperspectral data has a lot of redundancy, right? The neighboring bins in the spectrogram are highly correlated with each other. So it's quite effective, actually, to learn a latent space to compress out some of that redundancy. So first, we train this teacher model just to learn the latent space. We then freeze it. We throw away the decoder part. And we then train a projection module, the student module, that goes from the low-dimensional data into the latent space we've just learned. Okay, so we give this student model as input a low-dimensional input, and we ask it to guess what the latent space representation for the corresponding high-dimensional data should be. Right, and this is where we benefit from, the problem being much less under-constrained because the input-output dimensionalities are roughly similar to each other. And then the final stage of this process is we unfreeze the latent space and we connect the entire thing together end-to-end. So we input our low-dimensional data, we project it into the latent space, we decode from the latent space to the high-dimensional data, and we compare it with a loss function against the original. And we allow both the decoder and the projection function to be trained simultaneously, right? And that just allows us, the latent space that works best over here might not be quite optimal here, so we allow it to be adapted slightly. You can kind of see, actually, the overall structure here is kind of the same as the overall structure here. It's just that we've baked in some prior assumptions, I guess, in how this module should work and pre-trained it in particular ways. Okay, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about the exact network architecture of these things, because I think it's a bit boring, but a couple of things that are worth noting. So in the teacher model, the autoencoder, we used a lot of squeeze excitation blocks. Squeeze excitation blocks are quite useful for hyperspectral imaging. They're really good at squashing out the redundancy between the channels very effectively. Similarly, in the student network, I'm not going to go into detail about all of this, but generally speaking, we've got a standard UNet architecture, right? So we've got a downsampling and then an upsampling and skip connections. Within each of the blocks, we tried to, another cue that we use to try and help resolve this ambiguity problem is to bring in some spatial information, right? So although if I look at a tiny point there, I don't necessarily know what it is. If I look at the context around it, maybe I can say, okay, that looks like it's a seat cushion because it's part of a row of chairs. Okay, so I might be able to pick which spectra is most likely if I know the context it occurs in. So within these blocks, we have a couple of techniques to try and do that. MDTA is one of them, so it's basically a transformer attention block where we have one pathway that does global transformer attention over the spatial information in the scene. We have another pathway that does attention across the different bins of the spectrum, and then we have some cross-attention between the spatial and the spectral. GDFN is basically doing the same thing, but for convolutions. So we have some convolutions that go 1D convolutions across the spectra. We have 2D convolutions spatially across the scene, and then we have some crosstalk between those pathways. So in terms of the evaluation, we evaluated on 3 different data sets that had different channel depths, up to 200 channels. And we find that our approach becomes more and more effective the more channels you have, which is not surprising, right? The problem becomes more and more poorly constrained the more output channels you want. Working in a latent space helps reduce that under-constrainedness of the problem. Looking at the y-axis, we can see our techniques a couple of decibels more accurate than the previous techniques. Looking at the x-axis in terms of computational efficiency, it's about the same as previous techniques. The size of the blob tells you how many parameters the model uses. So you can see it's not the smallest model. A couple of these are a bit smaller, but it's modest sized. It's much smaller than some of these full transformer models. If we look at some of the results, so here I'm showing some error maps. We can see some of the data sets include like drone footage. Some of them are captured from the ground. The red parts are the areas that are being reconstructed badly. Blue parts are being reconstructed well. You can see there's certain types of materials that all the techniques really struggle with, right? So in this aerial footage, there's some lakes and bodies of water, and all the techniques really struggle to reconstruct the water. Same down here, the windows are always difficult, and sometimes the foliage as well. Even for our technique, Hydra, the same things are difficult, right? So the bodies of water are still the highest source of errors for us, maybe not so much the windows. But I think our errors are much lower. I think part of the reason for that is because we're working in a learned latent space, we're constrained to the manifold of realistic spectra, right? So even when our system doesn't really know what's going on, it always outputs a spectra that's kind of realistic, right? Whereas some of these other techniques, I think, when they don't know what's going on, they output something completely wild that could not be a real spectra. Here we can see some actual plots of the spectra predicted by the different techniques. I don't know how clear that is. So the red curve is the ground truth, the yellow curve is our prediction. This is for the data set that doesn't have that many channels. This is the medium one, and this is the one with the most channels. I think one thing that's very interesting is even the ground truth is really quite spiky and quite noisy, especially over here, right? And that's because the signal to noise ratio gets really bad when you have a lot of channels. I think what's interesting is the ground truth is noisy, and a lot of these other techniques also have very spiky outputs, which makes me think they're trying to learn to reproduce the noise of the data, which obviously is not possible, right? In contrast, our technique is really, really smooth, actually smoother than the ground truth. And I think that's because the latent space has kind of compressed out that noise. And so the predictions that we give don't have the noise overlaid on them. So, maybe you could make an argument that actually our predictions are more accurate than the ground truth because they don't have that noise. But maybe that's a bit of a stretch. Okay, so I've talked a bit about the localization, and I've talked a bit about the sensing pipeline. Next thing I want to talk about is modeling. Okay, so probably a lot of you guys know state of the art in 3D modeling is 3D Gaussian splatting these days, where we try to represent an environment using a cloud of hundreds of thousands of different Gaussians. They all have different shapes, different transparencies, different colors. So we had this work at CVPR last year, where we were trying to bring 3D Gaussian splatting into the hyperspectral domain. On the face of it, that doesn't sound like a very difficult problem, right? I'll just take my favorite 3D Gaussian splatting code base. I will find every occurrence of the number 3, and I'll replace it with the number 200, and magically it will just work for 200 channels, right? Unfortunately, it kind of does work, but not very well. There's a lot of challenges with hyperspectral data that need some special handling. One problem is 3D Gaussian splat models are really big, right? They take a lot of space to store. Rendering them takes a lot of compute power. And if you're talking about making it 100 times larger with all the color channels, it becomes impossible to store it, becomes impossible to render it, especially on a robot. So one of the things we had to do was we have to drop spherical harmonics in order to make this tractable. And by dropping spherical harmonics, we lose the ability to model view-dependent effects, right? So like specular reflections, directional lighting, we can't model those anymore without the spherical harmonics. Also, because there are so many color channels, and sometimes some of those color channels are very noisy, we struggle to get very fine detail in terms of the geometry. We don't know exactly where the boundaries are of objects very well. So the way we solved this is exactly the same way that we just solved the spectral reconstruction problem in Hydra. We just said, okay, I'm not going to do it directly in the hyperspectral space. I'm going to learn a latent spectral space, and I'm going to define my 3D Gaussian splat model to work in that latent space. Okay, so first I train a autoencoder on the full hyperspectral data. I learn a latent space, and then I say all of my Gaussians are going to have a signature associated with them, which represents where what their appearance should look like in the latent spectral space. I can then render that Gaussian cloud, and that will give me, my rasterizer will give me out a latent hyperspectral image. I can push it through my pre-trained decoder and get back out the full hyperspectral image. Okay, so there's still a few things we needed to do on top of that to make it work reliably. That was definitely the most important part. Actually, there was one other thing I should have mentioned on that note. One thing that's very interesting, I think, is we don't keep this frozen. Okay, so we learn a spectral space, a latent space, sorry, but we don't keep it frozen. Instead, while we're building this 3D Gaussian model, we kind of figure out what the colors are supposed to be of the Gaussians, but we also adapt the decoder, so we change the meaning of those different Gaussians, those different channels. The reason that's important, I think, is because up here, when we're pre-training it, when we're learning the latent space, we're working in a pure 2D domain, right? We're just doing compression, image compression. Whereas down here, we're working in a volumetric rendering space. We need to be able to blend together the different Gaussians with different latent spaces, and that has some very different properties, right? Up here, it doesn't really matter whether you can average together two things and get something meaningful or not. Down here, it's extremely important if Gaussians overlay each other, whether their blended product actually is meaningful or not. So it's very important for us to be able to adapt the latent space while we're building the model. Okay, so what extra bits did we have to add onto this to make it work reliably? One that I already mentioned was view directional lighting, right? So because we remove spherical harmonics, we can't get view-dependent effects anymore. And actually, that's really important for hyperspectral imaging. So we tried to find a lightweight way to reintroduce them. We basically built a small multi-layer perceptron that is fed with the Gaussian's original color information and also the viewing direction of the camera, and it modulates the Gaussian's appearance based on the viewing direction. And that's shared across all the Gaussians and all the viewpoints. Another issue is initialization, right? So normally, if you're doing 3D Gaussian splatting, when you want to initialize your model, what you'll often do is run a structure from motion technique, like Colmap or something, and you will extract the point cloud from that structure from motion. You use those to initialize the centers of all the Gaussians. You color the Gaussians based on the colors from the structure from motion, right? There is no structure from motion technique that works on hyperspectral data. So what we did was we automatically looked through the data set to find whichever spectral channel has the highest average contrast across the data set, and we run a grayscale structure from motion just on that channel, right? That gives us back the centroids for the Gaussians. Once we've got their centers, we reproject them to all of the different spectral images. We look up the spectra that they project to, and we average those spectra together, and that is our initial color for the Gaussians. Okay, so we have a special technique just for initializing the system before we start building it. The last thing that we had to change was the densification and pruning. So hyperspectral data is very sparse compared to RGB data. It's very noisy, especially when you're working in a latent space. By the kind of default 3DGS, densification and pruning doesn't actually work very well with that type of data. So we had to make a couple of changes to how it worked. In terms of densification, we had to, when we were deciding whether to split a Gaussian into multiple Gaussians, we have to average their contribution across lots of different viewpoints, not only individual views. And when we're deciding whether to prune a Gaussian and throw it away, we had to introduce an extra constraint, which is every place where that Gaussian is being blended, we look at the spectra associated with the Gaussian, we look at the spectra of the rendering. If there's any Gaussians who don't look similar to any of the things that they render, we increase the chance of pruning that Gaussian. So we've got an example here. So this is a novel viewpoint being rendered of our 3D model. You can see this is the ground truth for what it's supposed to look like. Our approach and the NERF approach both actually did quite a good job in terms of reconstructing the geometry. The traditional 3DGS approach did quite a bad job of getting the fine details of the geometry. If we look over here, so I've taken this pixel, and I've rendered out the spectra, the full spectra for every technique. We can see the red curve is the ground truth, the green one is ours, the blue one is NERF. So NERF has done a good job structurally at the geometry, but it's done a terrible job at reconstructing the actual spectra. The 3DGS approach did a better job with the spectra, but it failed with the geometry. I guess it goes without saying that our technique performed the best across the board, otherwise it wouldn't have been published at CVPR. But there's more interesting things that we can see in this table. So this base spec data set on the left, the data's a bit noisier, there's more color channels, but there's a lot of viewpoints, right? And the NERF approach actually does quite well here. I think NERF, when you have a lot of viewpoints to constrain the model, NERF actually is pretty reasonable. 3D Gaussian splatting didn't do that well here. On the other hand, over here with the surface optics data set, you have much fewer viewpoints. And in that case, the NERF approach has really struggled, whereas the 3DGS approach was a bit more robust. We did an ablation because obviously we changed a lot of different things about the technique, so we tried to unpick which of them were the most important. I think overall, the most important bit was working in the latent space. That seemed to have one of the largest contributions to performance. The densification, our own custom densification approach did a good job of increasing the accuracy of the model, but it also made the model 2.5 times as large. Then introducing our own pruning technique kind of brought the size of the model back down to something reasonable without significantly changing the visual quality. Okay, so in the works I've told you about so far, we've talked about if I already have a map of the environment, how can I localize my robot in it, right? And then I talked about if I already know the poses of the cameras, how can I build a model of the environment? So I think it's natural to ask, why don't we just do both of those at the same time? Why don't we do it online, right? That's the traditional robotics approach. So what I'm going to talk about now is hyperslam, so trying to do simultaneous localization and mapping with hyperspectral data. This technique has not been published yet. We've submitted a patent about it, but it's still under review for publication. So I'm not going to talk too much about the specific technical details of the technique, but I'll talk broadly about it and I'll show you some example demonstrations. Okay, so here we have a demonstration. My PhD student is holding a spectrometer here with a RealSense camera attached. Up here, you can see the live feed from the RealSense camera. Over here, you can see the 3D model that's being built, and this is a rendering at the current viewpoint of the 3D model. And you can see he's waving the spectrometer around. I think he's pressing a key on the keyboard every time he wants to record a spectral measurement. He records a spectral measurement at a particular point where he's pointing at, and then we propagate that out into the model based on some feature similarity, right? So we recognize the object that's being imaged and we spread the spectral measurement across the entire object. So here he's showing some novel viewpoints being rendered of that scene. You can see the different objects that he's collected have been highlighted in different colors. So there's a pink one, a green one, a yellow one. Each of those objects has its own spectral measurement associated with it. So because we're working with a spectrometer, we only get point measurements. We try to densify it out into the environment by spreading it. And here he's put the spectral up there, so you can see this is the one associated with one of those objects. Here, we've got a slightly newer version of the demonstration system where we've attached the spectrometer and the RealSense camera to our Boston Dynamics robot. He's walking around in the lab. And over here is a video of the same demo, but just showing the screen recording. Oh, there we go. You can see this crosshair here is where the spectrometer is pointing. And in this version of the demo, it flashes red and green. So here, instead of him pressing a button when he wants to take a spectral measurement, what we're doing is recognizing when the spectra changes significantly and automatically triggering, okay, this must be a new object, so take a new spectral measurement here, flag that as an object, and propagate out into the scene. I guess one thing that's worth noting is that all of this is running online in real time on a single desktop machine. So we're streaming the images from the robot to a desktop machine, just has one GPU in it. We do still want to try and run it on board. There's an Orin on here that we'd like to run it on. But at the moment, I'm still pretty happy that we're running it in real time on a single GPU at least. And also able to get the data across the Wi-Fi in a reasonable time. Okay, so here we're looking at the reconstruction afterwards. So this is some novel viewpoints of the 3D model that we built. And I think in a second, the student will toggle on the spectral display. Yep, so you can see this red spectra down here is associated with the red object in the scene, which is this door. It's correctly recognized that this bin is a different object, so it's propagated the spectral measurement out across this entire door. Now the students changed, this blue measurement is associated with this big piece of wall here, right? So this time around, it was automatically recognized and inserted into the map rather than him manually choosing it. This green one, I think, is this hanging cloth here, and I think there's a pink one over here. So I guess an interesting thing about this is because the spectral information is baked directly into the 3D model, we can render new viewpoints of this scene, and we already know what the spectral information should look like at that new viewpoint. Right, so it's actually the Gaussians themselves that have this spectral information associated with them. That yellow box there seems a bit more spiky for some reason. Maybe it was a bit darker in that part of the lab. And then there's a pink one for this object here. Okay, for this version of the demo, we were using a hyperspectral camera instead of a spectrometer. So that means that we have a unique spectral signature at every point in the scene. We captured it all at once. And I think the student has rendered that out to a novel viewpoint, and he's going to show you that every single part of that scene has its own spectra associated with it. So he's going to... Oh. These videos are huge, so my laptop might be struggling a bit. Come on. So what's going to happen when it decides to play that part of the video is that he will render a novel view, he'll click on a load of different points, and then it will graph out the spectra associated with all those different points. An interesting... Okay, maybe I'll skip that for now. But one interesting thing is because we were using a hyperspectral camera instead of a spectrometer, we get a unique signature at every point of the scene, but the channel depth is a bit lower, right? So the number of channels is lower than when we were using the spectrometer, but it's more spatially useful. Okay, so just to map back to the original point of the talk, I wanted to tell you about navigating beyond RGB. And I didn't only mean helping our robots to navigate beyond RGB. I mean us as researchers trying to navigate ourselves and our research journey beyond only thinking about RGB. So to that end, I've tried to present a range of different works that feed into each other. We've talked about the underlying perception model, how we can set up the sensor pipeline. We've talked about modeling, how can we build 3D models using that kind of spectral data. We've talked about how we can localize robots using those models if we have them. We've talked about how to online build a hyperspectral understanding of our environments for robots. I think there's lots of parts of that vision that I tried to give you at the start that are still open for you guys to try and look at as well. So all of the stuff about autonomy, I think is really cool, and my group haven't really looked at that too much yet. So trying to understand how we can interact with the environment informed by what the environment is made of, I think is a really interesting problem that's underexplored. In things like, also things like inspection and maintenance, how we can inform the decisions we make based on the composition of the environment. Also, I think there's probably lots of other perception tasks that could be adapted to hyperspectral data. So my group are looking at the moment at relocalization and scene relighting and a few other things in the hyperspectral domain, but I'm sure there are millions of other problems that solutions exist for RGB, but not for hyperspectral data. I already mentioned before, I think a big challenge in the area is the lack of data. The cameras are expensive, data's hard to collect. We're trying to put together a big data set of natural robotics data that we want to release to the community to try and get more people working on this stuff. But I don't know how quickly we'll be able to do that. But overall, I think hyperspectral imaging is a really interesting way to try and get our robots to not just understand where things are in the environment, but understand what they are and what they're made of. Okay, so my overall summary is if you're doing something with a robot and your robot sees the world the same way that you do, just ask yourself, does it need to see the world the same way you do? Do you need to have that shared understanding, or can you do better than that? Can your robot be better than human? As a slight side note, there are other superhuman robotic perception problems that I'm also interested in. So I also do a lot of work on event cameras and neuromorphic vision, trying to help robots to see the world faster and react more quickly than humans. It's a bit tangential to this talk, but it's also an area of interest of mine. Okay, just to wrap up, I just want to say thank you to acknowledge the collaborators. So obviously, I didn't do any of this work, right? All of this work was done by clever people. I'm just the supervisor. Actually, everything that I told you about now was done by a single PhD student, Chris Thurgood. Chris is really a great researcher. He's finishing up his thesis now, and he's looking for postdocs later this year. So if you have projects that might be relevant to this, feel free to reach out to him. I highly recommend him. If you want to see any of his publications or any of the materials he's released, there's a QR code up there that will link to them. I also want to acknowledge our sponsors. So i3D Robotics and IS Instruments, they make the spectrometers that we used in a lot of the demonstration systems there. That's all I've got for you. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.